Great. And so I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Brett Webster. I am with Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, and working with the team at Mass CEC and Energy and Environmental Economics, as well as the Massachusetts IOUs on this grid services study. This is the second workshop as part of the stakeholder engagement arm of this work. And I will just review briefly the overall objectives of the study, and then Sarah Cullinan from Mass CEC will go into more depth on the background and context for this work. But the overall objectives are to develop a methodology for calculating the location-specific value that distributed energy resources can provide in Massachusetts. So really focusing on the values to the distribution grid specifically. The second objective is to explore potential compensation frameworks specific to these grid services values that balance both policy objectives and avoid overlap with other incentives or value streams that are already being provided in Massachusetts. The third objective is to recognize the equity and environmental justice impacts in both the valuation and compensation approaches to grid services. The fourth will be to create a roadmap to guide both near and long-term development of grid services programs in the state. And then the fifth is to provide ongoing opportunities to incorporate stakeholder input and make sure that this process is open and collaborative, and we're incorporating the perspectives of all the folks who this work will touch. And so thank you for joining this workshop, as this is one of the primary avenues we have to do that. Next slide, please. So just to recap on what we covered in workshop one, was mostly foundational understanding of what distributed energy resources are, what are the types of services they can provide, and then how stakeholders can be involved in this work. There is a recording of workshop one, and the slides from workshop one can be found on the Mass CEC website. So if you were unable to attend, I encourage you to go there to get caught back up. And now, next slide, please. So in workshop two, our objectives are sort of in two buckets. The first is the content that this grid services team would like to share with all of you as stakeholders in this process. And that content is really focused around the intended approaches to valuing distribution grid services. So how the E3 team is proposing to calculate the valuation, and how we'll be thinking about that distinct from other avenues of incentives or valuing distributed energy resources, as I already mentioned. And then to introduce potential mechanisms for compensating that grid services value. What we're then asking from you all as part of this workshop is to give input both into the valuation and compensation mechanisms, and then also on the key considerations for implementation and reducing barriers to access from an equity standpoint. So we will, so that is sort of a key objective in the workshop today. Next slide, please. Our agenda in service of those objectives is we're in the midst of a welcome and introduction. I will pass it to Mass CEC in a moment to give more of the background and context for bigger picture for what this grid services study is and in the context within which it sits. We will then transition to about 50 minutes of presentation from E3 on much of the work to date. So focusing on the methodology around deferral valuation, a concept called bridge to wires, and how we're proposing to value that, and then environmental justice considerations and approaches to valuation. We'll then have a 10-minute break, and when we reconvene, we will E3 will again present on the types of compensation mechanisms that are being considered and the implementation roadmap. In each of these segments of presentation, there will be opportunities for clarifying questions, but we'll focus those questions as just that, sort of more clarifying questions, because then when we transition at 2:35 into breakout rooms, we will have a dedicated chunk of about 55 minutes for to collect input from you all. So we'll talk more about the breakout room structure, but we'll be in split across 5 breakout rooms, each with a facilitator and a note taker, to really dive into your feedback and input, and we'll have some dedicated prompts and structure to those breakout rooms. We'll then reconvene from the breakout rooms at 3:15 or so, and then discuss closing and next steps. So we may end up ending 20 to 30 minutes earlier than the workshop hold is scheduled for. And then next slide, please. So some ground rules for participation in our workshop together today. We ask folks to please mute yourself when you are not speaking, just to minimize the background noise. We strongly suggest minimizing distractions as folks are mostly joining remotely. So silencing your phone during the workshop and minimizing the interaction you have with other apps and web browsing. We ask folks to use the chat to post questions as we go along. So as things come up, feel free to drop them in the chat. And then you can also use the raise hand function, which is again at the bottom menu of the Zoom application, to ask questions during the dedicated Q&A periods that I mentioned. Verbal questions would be great as well. I already mentioned this piece around dedicated Q&A after each topic. And then it'd be great if folks could identify themselves when speaking or commenting in the chat, just to get to know who is speaking up and what organization you're associated with. Next slide, please. So this is the second of 4 workshops in this series, and we'll circle back to this again at the end of our time together today. There will be 2 additional workshops. Those meeting announcements will be sent out by email to the workshop mailing list. If you're not currently on that list, there is a link provided in the slides here to join. And then these slides from this workshop and the recordings will be made available on the Mass CEC website at the link listed there. And then that link also provides some general information and context for the study. And then again, this is not the only avenue for feedback and input. And so we've listed out some emails here that you are welcome to get in touch with to share additional questions, feedback, or input with at any point. And we really welcome you to take advantage of that avenue as well. So with that, I will pass it to Sarah from Mass CEC to give us a bit more background on the study.
All right. Thanks, Brett. Can everyone hear me? Can I get a...
Yes, we hear you.
Thank
great.
You. All right. I'm Sarah Cullinan. I direct our Net Zero Grid program at Mass CEC. Mass CEC, for those not familiar, is Massachusetts clean energy economic development arm of the state government. We're a quasi-state entity. We're focused on strengthening and supporting the Massachusetts economy by catalyzing the innovation that's needed to realize our clean, affordable, and equitable energy future in Massachusetts. What does my Net Zero Grid team do? We're focused on fostering innovation in the grid as it relates to energy transition. So the grid, as many of you are aware, will be the primary platform for decarbonization. And a lot of changes are needed to get it there to where it needs to be. For a successful grid transition, we'll need lots of new technology, but we'll also need new ways of working, new business models, and new programs to support it. So as part of my team's work, We see earlier and deeper collaboration with our utilities and with lots of other grid-facing stakeholders as really critical to the grid transition, particularly when we're navigating innovative ideas and models. So this project is one example of us doing that. MassDEC has convened this collaborative working group that you see the partners listed here to do this study. We are all working in very close partnership on this. As kind of the roles here, like I said, we're working in close partnership, but any kind of formal implementation will be taken up by the EDCs, we also call those the utilities, electric distribution companies. The concept for this was originally proposed in the electric sector modernization plans, where the EDCs also received they were enabled to set up a compensation fund to test out models of grid services. So that's kind of some connective tissue around what we're doing here. Next slide, please. All right, we'll briefly touch on what are DERs. Many people are coming from different backgrounds, and even those of you who are very familiar with DERs or experts in them will also appreciate that DER can have many different meanings. So this is ours. DERs are technologies connected to the distribution grid, which can generate electricity or reduce or shift grid loads. Includes things like energy efficiency, demand response, distributed solar, distributed energy storage, and electrification loads, such as from EVs and heat pumps. DERs can provide a range of services to the grid, which we'll talk more about. And they can have a critical role in meeting local demand, easing localized constraints, and improving reliability. I like to think about DERs for our purposes as the thousands and soon to be millions of little interactive nodes on the grid that we're going to rely more on as we move into our energy transition. Next slide, please. So DERs can provide a variety of valuable functions for the grid. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean by grid services? What are we talking about in terms of DER value? It turns out there's quite a few different things that DERs can do. They can support and supplement different distribution grid functions by generating and reducing loads. That's something that, for example, solar can do. They can also shift loads. Batteries and demand response can do that. And by doing those things, DERs can reduce the cost of building and operating the grid by taking some strain off of it. And by doing that, utilizing DERs and the inherent flexibility they have can provide ratepayer savings, ratepayer benefit. In addition to those kind of monetizable or those real kind of dollar value savings to ratepayers, DERs can have other benefits that might not be monetizable, but are still real societal benefits. And we also want to think about those in this study. We're calling those non-rate impacts. Finally, Brett mentioned this once, we'll mention it a couple other times, but it's really important to note that we're focused specifically on the distribution system and very locational and time-specific impacts. You'll hear those words harped on, at least by me, quite a bit. Location and time are very important here. Next slide. All right. So we wanted to provide kind of a structure to think about where grid services are coming from, and kind of put a finer point on that location-specific aspect here. So distribution grid services refer to a very specific set of location-specific impacts or location-specific benefits. So starting, and this graphic is of our energy system, starting on the left. You can walk your way down the energy system, starting with generation. And each step of the way, the system gets more kind of fragmented as I would think about it, kind of like a fractal. It gets more distributed. And every time you step down the system services a smaller number of customers. So look, we're looking here, starting on the left at generation. A single solar plant could be servicing electrons to, be connected to essentially 1 million customers. Moving down to where those electrons meet the transmission system, you're getting the system splits to another branch. The transmission system, a specific part of it, a specific piece of equipment, services a much smaller portion of customers. Continuing down to the distribution level, it happens again, and distribution, a single transformer is servicing a much smaller number of customers. So as you're thinking about kind of going down the system as a funnel, when DERs are connected somewhere on the distribution system to a home, when they respond to something on the grid, they're really only impacting a specific part, a specific piece of equipment on the distribution system. And that's why location matters when we're talking about grid services. Next slide. We're hoping that this kind of further cements this idea, in that if you're looking at the picture here, to reduce the strain on that red transformer, you need DERs on the houses that are downstream of that specific transformer. The ones on a different arm of the grid won't help this substation. So if you call on those, it's not going to help your red constraint here. That's why location matters, and why time matters too, because that loading will happen at different times of the day. And the DERs have to respond exactly when it's needed and where it's needed. All right, next slide. Taking a step back, the electric grid is evolving rapidly. To state the obvious that I've already stated, with new types of, there are going to be new types of loads on the system, and lots of new DERs connecting all the time. So this means that we're going to have lots of new challenges in meeting those loads and connecting those DERs, but also new opportunities to solve those problems with all these new resources available to us. So making the most of DERs requires rethinking the traditional ways that we planned and operated the system. On that front, existing frameworks for valuing and compensating DERs, the ones that we use today, tend to be really good at focusing on the general system-wide value, but they don't focus on determining value on the distribution system. So the point of this study is to begin to build that framework to understand the value at that specific location level, and putting that together with guiding principles for turning that conceptual value of what can a DER do, what can it do as a grid service, into a concrete action plan for the state. In other words, we know that DERs and their flexibility is valuable, but how do we unlock and harness it? This study is that piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. All right. So to list out the more specific kind of study questions, I can review them quickly here. We want to think about over the course of the study, what are the benefits that DERs can provide to the grid? How do we quantify those benefits? Including how do we incorporate the non-monetizable benefits that DERs can provide? What determines where on the grid the benefits, where they'll appear and what they'll provide? We realize that there might be differential benefits provided in EJ populations, and we want to think about if that's the case, and if so, how do we differently value that? We want to think about what's required for the utilities to be able to actually operationalize, to use DERs to benefit the grid. And to do that, we're thinking very specifically about compensation. In the near term, what can we do to start to put pilots out there, start to implement uses of compensating DERs, and then over time, how do we expand that? How do we keep learning how to develop some more of a standard offering, standard programs across the state? So this is going to be something that evolves over time. This is not, there's a lot of complexity here. And so this is the first steps of making those first, the first attempts at operationalizing. All right. So we want to focus today mostly on compensation. To put some framing around that, there's a couple different goals that any compensation mechanism that's designed has to balance. Starting with that green bubble on the bottom, compensation needs to realize value for the grid as well as the wider community. And in this study, we also really want to focus on equity impacts as it relates to providing that value and realizing that value. Moving to the yellow bubble on the left, this ties in part to that equity question. Any compensation mechanism needs to be able to manage cost shifts by understanding how the value that a DER is providing compares to the compensation that's going out. E3 will talk more about that in a moment. And then finally, compensation also has to encourage program participation. So if there's no incentive to participate or the barriers to participating are too high, then participants can't even generate the benefits that we're looking for in the first place. So those are the kind of the major competing goals that we see. And then on top of all of that, a compensation structure also needs to be transparent and needs to be understandable. So those are kind of the goals that we're looking at them in terms of the output of whatever a compensation will look like. Next slide. All right, so moving back to kind of a more practical way to think about the work that we're doing. These are 4 kind of work products that we're driving toward with this study. The first one is a valuation framework. Really, this is looking at how do we put a dollar value on the benefits that a DER provides when it addresses a grid need. So can it decrease need in a way that reduces ratepayer cost? And how do we put a dollar value on that? How do we pin it down? The second work product is a compensation mechanism. So knowing the value from step 1 from the evaluation framework, how can we pay a DER to provide those services? How do we get DERs to participate, and how do we kind of reflect the value that they're providing within some compensation offering? The third deliverable in near-term implementation is answering the question of how do we get a payment system off the ground? How do we start pilots? How do we start using DERs and collecting information and improve and learn more about how to do this better over time? And then finally, a long-term implementation plan. The utilities and the DPU, as they've approved the ESMP orders, see grid services as playing a key role in as the Commonwealth modernizes the electric system. So if we're thinking about kind of how this is going to play out over time, we want to create the roadmap for making sure that we are evolving our understanding of grid services and developing some kind of program over time that can utilize DERs in this way. Next slide. All right, so today we're really talking mostly about those first 2 buckets. In terms of valuation, we'll walk through the valuation framework. We'll pass it over to E3 to do that. We spent a lot of time developing that valuation framework based on the information that we can get and that we have available to us. And we want to present the framework that we've thought through as background information. And then today we want to focus most of our conversation and feedback around the compensation mechanism. So kind of understanding where we are with valuation. How do we then step into this next phase of how do we turn that valuation into dollars that DERs can respond to? All right, and I think I'm handing it over to Andrew now.
Thanks. Yeah, so as Sarah just stated, the first piece we want to tackle here is valuation, just to provide some general background, and we'll focus on that until the break, and then we'll jump into compensation. So Valuation we really see as providing kind of a North Star to the compensation and everything else that goes into a program. By determining first the value of distribution grid services that DERs are able to provide, we can set a sort of guideline or guidepost for what sort of compensation we might be aiming for. We always want to keep this overhead and in our sights, hence the North Star analogy, at all times throughout the process. Even if it ends up that the compensation doesn't exactly match valuation, it should be a conscious decision. So we want to talk about how the value ends up accruing from DERs, which we'll get into the specifics of very shortly, as Stephanie and Hannah will present that. But generally, DERs can reduce total costs for things like electric infrastructure and ultimately result in savings for the utilities and then ratepayers. So those savings can come back then to DERs. This graphic illustrates at the top through incentive payments. If we quantify the value of DERs from reducing costs, that's the sort of guidepost then for setting those incentive payments. We kind of have a sense of what pool of money is available to us for those incentives. As I mentioned, compensation won't always have to be exactly equal to the value provided. Depending on policy objectives, you might end up paying more or less for a service, and it's explicitly sort of monetizable for the grid. However, if this varies, it needs to be, again, this is just going to keep repeating myself here, that it needs to be a conscious decision, something that we want to be aware of in advance. This is really especially important for utilities because often it turns out that already disadvantaged communities end up footing sort of a relatively high energy burden, or a high proportion of their income and savings goes towards their energy bill. And so if you're putting additional strain on the rates, often that gets borne by low income or already disadvantaged communities for various reasons. So I have a graphic here just to talk about a few different scenarios on what happens if compensation and value don't explicitly match. Just want to illustrate this point for grid investments and DERs specifically, to walk through these scenarios. So first, the box on the left with just the one bar, you can kind of see this is the status quo before there's any DER incentives in place or compensation at all coming into play. So you have an infrastructure need and it costs X amount of money. So that's just what you have to pay to meet that need. For example, you're paying for equipment at a substation or a new transformer. To the right, we have two bars where you're starting to pull in some of the DERs and the value they can provide. On the left side, you have the infrastructure cost, which is now decreased by that in a hashed bar by some amount due to the DERs that are being utilized. It's not gone away entirely, but the infrastructure cost is reduced significantly. That decrease in costs in this case is then translated purely into a DER incentive value. So that's the grid services value is now matched to what the incentives paid out are. This situation then has basically no net savings or benefit, no net impact really at all to non-participants, but it's just shifting the money around so that the money, instead of going to infrastructure, is going to DERs. So in this scenario, you're promoting DER adoption and participation in the program without really costing or saving money for ratepayers in either direction. The two bars, or two sets of bars on the right, you have a couple different scenarios when compensation and value don't match. The third scenario, you might target to have some savings for ratepayers. So that way it's sort of a everybody wins scenario. You can see here the DER incentives paid out are actually less than the grid services value provided. The DERs are still getting paid somewhat, but the benefits are being shared with the ratepayers. So ratepayers are getting something and the DERs are getting something compared to the original status quo. The potential downside of this then is it won't necessarily maximize DER participation in a program. So you're leaving money on the table from the DER's perspective, so it is resulting in savings for ratepayers. So this, from a policy perspective, can still be seen as a good thing. On the far right, you have a scenario where DERs are actually paid out more than the grid services value that's being provided. Again, this is something that could be desirable if you're trying to target market transformation, or if you think that the DERs are specifically supporting equity or some other policy goals that you have in mind. However, you need to pay attention here when this increases costs for all ratepayers. And again, this, as I mentioned, might be borne most heavily or most relative impact can be higher by non-participants who may include low-income or disadvantaged communities who can't necessarily afford to put these DERs and don't see that money coming back to them. So we just want to be very conscious as we're going through these steps of what scenario is arising and make sure that it aligns with our policy goals. And we're not just setting incentive levels arbitrarily. All that in mind, we also want to be clear about the objectives for this program. As Sarah's mentioned a couple times, Brett's mentioned, and we're going to keep mentioning that we're really focused on the distribution grid services value here. And we want to target only the incremental value for distribution that DERs can provide. That location-specific value, which existing frameworks, which we have programs for like Connected Solutions, Smart, Clean Peak, Net Metering, and those are all set up to address other benefits in terms of energy costs, avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, transmission capacity, all great values to the system. But they're not necessarily as framed or concentrated around those designed to address those distribution benefits, which are hyper-localized. So we don't want to be re-evaluating all of those other programs here, but we also want to make sure we're not double counting. So that's why we're really honed in on just focusing on the value that's provided through the distribution grid services. So what is in the bucket still of distribution grid services? And I think Brett had introduced this earlier. First, we have deferral value, which refers to value from delaying investments, providing savings in the interim, and opening up also kind of an additional subcategory of optionality value. And I'm going to just say right here that if you don't understand this from the get-go, that's totally fine. And I think everybody's on the same page the first time around. These can be complicated concepts. Stephanie is going to walk through them a little bit later as well. The optionality value here is especially a little bit trickier to quantify, but the idea behind it is that there's some benefit in being able to wait and see how the grid changes before you commit to long-term investments. So the deferral has sort of two aspects to it. Bridge to wires value refers to situations where there's some immediate infrastructure need. You need to replace a transformer because it's going to be overloaded, and you can't meet that need fast enough through traditional means. You can't acquire the new transformer and get it all set up within the lead time you need for that demand coming online. Here, DERs can plug in and act as sort of a substitute until the system can be built out. So the bridge to wires is referring to the fact that it's bridging the gap until the wires solution, which isn't just wires, but all that associated equipment can actually be put in place. And then finally, there may also be environmental justice and non-rate impacts that are specifically tied to distribution grid services. So if DERs can perform functions that alleviate negative impacts or provide benefits specifically to environmental justice communities or populations, we want to explore those and recognize them. Some of these might not show up as explicitly in utility rates, or at least the impact on equity might not. And so these can get a little bit trickier to quantify and ultimately might end up being tied to one of the other two aspects I mentioned, deferral or bridge to wires, simply in order to include it in the compensation structure. So again, just pausing here. Don't worry if these explanations of the three services are not clear yet. Hopefully what Stephanie and Hannah are going to describe will address these a little bit further and provide some examples to make things a little bit clearer. We're describing, again, the value of all these different grid services because we think valuation is really important for all the reasons I've noted, and to provide some level of transparency and opportunity for you to ask questions and hopefully get some sense of understanding. But again, it's difficult to understand on the first pass. It's hard for us to nail down even. So you can think of this largely as background, just setting the scene before we dive in. Then we're going to move over to the topics of compensation, and then largely in the next workshop, more implementation. But we'll introduce that all and turn the mic over to you for the breakout sessions, and we'll have plenty of questions for you there. So just to put an analogy in it, you kind of don't need to know how the ice cream is made in order to share your thoughts on what flavor you prefer and whether you like it in a cup or cone or whatnot. So we're talking right now about sort of making the ice cream, that valuation. We're going to ask you about what's your favorite flavor? How do you want it presented? That's all the compensation side and how it's all paid out. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Stephanie first.
Thanks. Hey everyone, my name is Stephanie Kinzer. I'm a senior consultant at E3. And as Andrew explained, I'm going to talk through each of the distribution grid services that he just opened with and explain what they are in more detail and how we're calculating their value. So as Andrew said, our goal is to be transparent about how we're calculating each of these, since they're ultimately going to inform the compensation that will be paid out to DERs. So we'll start with our valuation method for the deferral of distribution investments. So the key question that we want to start with here is, what is the value of delaying, or in other words, deferring an investment to a later date? So just starting off with a basic financial principle is that money is worth more today than at a future time, because if we're able to invest that money, we can earn interest or a return on it. And this is known as the time value of money. So based on this principle, if we can delay an investment on a grid upgrade, we can save money. However, there's an expectation in some cases of near-term capacity shortfalls that are going to limit our opportunity to defer or delay those investments. So for example, if we have a substation that can't support the demand from more electrification of, say, gas furnaces to heat pumps, then we can't delay that investment. But if we have DERs behind that substation that are able to shift load during peak hours and limit that capacity shortfall, we can enable the utility to delay the investment. So all this is to say that when we talk about deferral solutions, we mean DERs that are already existing or that can be deployed to a location to delay a capacity upgrade investment. So I want to illustrate this concept a little bit to give more context on what I was just saying. So in the dark blue, that kind of squiggly line, we have our historical load. And in the light blue, we show how we expect load to grow over time, for example, from electrification. And then in that orange, we have the substation capacity. So where the blue and the orange line intersect, the load will exceed the substation capacity, and we need to make an investment to upgrade that capacity or increase the substation's headroom. But if we're able to use DERs to reduce load during peak hours, our new demand would be that green line, and we can wait to make the upgrade investment until that green line is able to intersect with the orange line. So it's really these difference in these timelines and difference in loads that creates the savings from delaying our investment. Can go to the next slide, thanks. So now that we kind of have that conceptual framework, I want to turn to the actual calculation that we're using to quantify the deferral value. Essentially, we're basing the value on the discount value of the deferred investment. So we calculate the revenue requirement for the original investment starting in year zero, and we're also calculating the revenue requirement for the deferred investment, say in year 3. So the revenue requirement is the amount of money that the utility is collecting from customers to pay back its cost for that investment and to earn a reasonable return. So this kind of like lighter blue text is explaining all of the actual components that go into calculating that revenue requirement. And then we're calculating the net present value for each of for the original investments revenue requirement and the deferred investments revenue requirement. And the net present value is how we're thinking of the value of some kind of future set of cash flows in terms of what it might be worth today. And then ultimately, the deferral value that the benefit that will be paid out to DERs is equal to the net present value of that original investment's revenue requirement minus the net present value of that deferred investment's revenue requirement, overall divided by the capacity need at a given location. And this gives us $1 per kilowatt value. So this is kind of just how we're thinking about this calculation behind the scenes, but the overall takeaway here is just that the deferral value is the value of delaying an investment. So moving on to our second distribution or grid distribution benefit here, we're going to talk about the optionality value, which is really an additional component of the deferral value. And this is because delaying an investment has another benefit. So to explain this, we know that when we're doing distribution planning, we can't fully account for the uncertainty of the future. There's just a lot of things that we don't know for sure. We're not sure how much load is going to grow, whether it could be faster or slower than expected. We don't know how the capabilities of technologies are going to evolve. Infrastructure costs may be more or less expensive in the future than they are now. And there may be updates to policies or rate structures. And we also are unsure of how customers are going to respond and how their behavior will change in relation to those policies and rate structures. So delaying an investment can allow utilities to get more information and to reassess conditions before they have to make those investments. Essentially, we're reducing some level of uncertainty. So here, our definition of the optionality value is the benefit of reducing inefficiencies in spending due to improved foresight over time. Next slide, please. So similar to our last graphs, I want to illustrate this with two graphs and think that this concept is a little bit more complicated. So we have lots more in our appendix if you're interested and want to take a look after to walk through this. But to put it hopefully fairly simply, very similar to our last graph, we have our historical load in that dark blue and the existing substation capacity in orange. And essentially, utilities plan for the practical worst case scenario. So this is the line in gold in the first graph, for instance. But it's possible that that practical worst case scenario won't plan out and that any future load growth could happen within the blue shaded area of the triangle. So looking to our second graph, if we're able to defer our investment, that's that kind of delay that we're pointing out in green, the blue triangle of possible outcomes actually gets a little bit smaller. We're improving our foresight on what the practical worst case scenario that we have to plan for could be. So I'm going to pull back and give an example that's not related to electricity planning. So I live in San Francisco and say that I'm planning a trip to Boston in May. If I have to pack my bag today, I don't have a good idea of what the weather is going to be in May. It could be fairly cold or warm, but I really need to pack for all scenarios. So I'm going to bring like a pretty big coat along and also shorts and a t-shirt in case it ends up being really warm. But if I'm able to instead pack the day before my trip, like, I don't know, May 2nd, let's say, I can see that it's going to be in the 70s all week long, and I can leave my big coat behind and make my packing more efficient. So it's the same concept here, just having better insight by waiting to a later date to see what conditions have looked like in the meantime. So with that concept in mind, I want to return to the graphs and get a little bit more technical and explain how we're calculating the value. So we're simulating outcomes across many different probabilistic future scenarios, essentially many of the scenarios that could happen within that blue shaded triangle. And we're determining the probability weighted amount that we are overspending on the investment. So we're taking the difference in spending inefficiency between scenario A, or the first graph, and scenario B, the second graph. And this difference in overspend is the optionality value. So hopefully that's fairly clear, but to sum it up, the difference in the spending inefficiency is the optionality benefit that we're getting for the distribution grid services. Okay, so one other value DERs can provide is a bridge to wires benefit. And the key question for this benefit is, what if the utility identifies a distribution grid need, but isn't able to address it quickly enough? So we know we have some infrastructure projects that are slated to add more capacity, but that have a long lead time, and construction can't be completed before there is an expected capacity shortfall. So to address this capacity shortage, we can deploy interim solutions, or the utility will have to face operational risks. And I'll kind of go into these in a few more slides. But our definition for bridge to wire solutions are DERs deployed to a location with an imminent capacity constraint to mitigate risks where a traditional solution cannot be quickly deployed and alternate interim solutions may be suboptimal. So to illustrate this, we have a very similar graph as before, with our actual load and load growing over time, and with a substation with limited capacity. But in this case, we know that there is going to be a capacity shortfall in the near future. But even if we start the permitting and construction for upgrading that substation today, the new substation capacity isn't going to be operational until it's exceeded that little triangle in red. But DERs may be able to bridge this gap. They can dispatch during critical periods of peak demand to address that shortfall, that little blue area. So without DER dispatch, as I said before, utilities have to consider trade-offs when there isn't going to be enough capacity. So some of these trade-offs include deploying interim solutions. So this is like bringing a backup generator or a short-term battery storage to a specific site to provide electricity behind it. Utilities could face asset degradation. The performance of the infrastructure could be reduced and become more likely to fail. There's an increased risk of customer outages, or we could potentially have to connect fewer customers over a longer period of time. So bridge to wires DERs can help avoid these trade-offs, ultimately creating value for the distribution system. But to monetize this value, we really need an approach that can sufficiently quantify the value of these trade-offs. And so as one approach, we're calculating the avoided cost of a backup generator that would need to be deployed in the case of a capacity shortfall. And to do this, we're looking at the expenses of that backup generator. So what are the costs of kind of setting it up and deploying it? What are the fuel costs while running it to get a $1 per kilowatt value? And then in an ideal scenario, we would want to quantify each of these trade-offs that I've listed here and determine their value at a given location. But as of now, we really can't reliably quantify each of these other trade-offs. And it's difficult to know kind of which trade-offs are going to be necessary at a given location. So for now, we've stuck with calculating the cost of a kind of average backup generator for a constrained distribution location. And then finally, I also want to note that like a backup generator has non-rate impacts, such as air pollution, that we also want to consider valuing as a non-rate impact. And I'll turn it over to Hannah to discuss those now.
Sorry, just before we jump over, I see Zach, did you have a clarifying question on what Stephanie presented?
Hi, I was actually just hoping to get in line after this section for Q&A, so I'll cover my question then.
Okay, great.
Great.
Thanks, Andrew and Stephanie. My name is Hannah Platter. I'm a senior consultant with E3, and today I'll be discussing some of the environmental justice benefits as part of our proposed valuation methodology. Thus far, we've mostly been talking about financial impacts of our distributed energy resources, which impact utility financials and therefore impact customers through changes to rates. We also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of other benefits and harms of these programs that won't directly impact utility financials and therefore won't directly impact rates. We also know that based on historical inequities, a lot of these impacts are going to be disproportionately felt by disadvantaged communities and environmental justice populations. So in the following few slides, I'll be talking about some of the impacts and potential additional compensation that we could provide for these disadvantaged communities and environmental justice populations. Starting with what these impacts might look like, we've broadly grouped these impacts into two categories. On the left, we have impacts that we're hoping to quantify, and on the right, we have impacts that, despite being very real, we struggle to put very precise numbers on for a variety of reasons. When we get to breakout rooms, this is something we're definitely looking for feedback on, so feel free to suggest either additional impacts that we haven't considered or potential ways to quantify some of these impacts when we get to breakout rooms. Starting on the left, we have our quantifiable impacts. So these mostly apply to the bridge to wires concept that Stephanie just talked about. So as Stephanie mentioned, if a utility needs some sort of bridge to wires resource in an area, they have a few different options of how they'll be able to reach that. We mentioned adding battery storage, which we think, at least in this context, has minimal impacts. There's also the possibility of diesel generators, or potentially, and we think this is less likely, having no solution, which would lead to outages. For diesel generators, as Stephanie mentioned, there are air quality and human health impacts, which could be avoided with these distributed energy resources. And then in the case of a potential power outage, which could also be avoided with distributed energy resources, there are real impacts on customers as well. So these are things that we have a few methods that we're considering for quantifying. And moving on to the other side of the slide, for our qualitative impacts, again, we don't have the means to quantify these in this analysis, but we still recognize that there's a lot of value and a lot of importance of these things. They could apply to either deferral or bridge to wire scenarios and include things like construction, which causes disruption, potential traffic, noise, pollution, which could either be deferred or completely avoided with localized distributed energy resources. And then there's also the impacts of labor and economics. This could either be a potential benefit, not a harm, like the other concept we've talked about. We've heard feedback that construction could increase local jobs, increase local foot traffic in small businesses, but we don't know exactly how this conflicts with some of the harms of construction that we've mentioned earlier. So again, we're not quite sure how to quantify this. Next slide, please. Once we determine exactly which values we're going to hopefully put a dollar value on, the next question is who we think should be eligible in this context to receive incremental compensation for these benefits. There's two different options we could consider here. On the left, we talk about qualified customers. In this case, we would offer this additional compensation to customers who themselves are disadvantaged households. So the exact qualifications of this is something we'll be discussing later. If you have feedback, we'd love to hear it in the breakout rooms. But the general idea here is that we provide this economic benefit to participating customers only who themselves are getting this money. So this would be additional money directly to customers who are most in need. The second option on the right is considering compensation to all participating customers who live within designated environmental justice populations. So this honors the fact that some benefits have impacts that are felt by the full community. So for example, a very wealthy customer who lives in a low-income neighborhood, if they install a distributed energy resource, which is able to avoid the need for a diesel generator in their neighborhood, the entire neighborhood, which might be designated an environmental justice population, would see this air quality benefit, not just the customer themselves. So in that case, even customers who themselves we would not consider to be disadvantaged, if they are providing benefits to their local disadvantaged or environmental justice populations, could still get this environmental justice adder. Next slide, please. This slide looks at some of our mechanisms for evaluating and compensating these impacts that we've just discussed. So on the left, we're looking at our bridge to wires scenario, as Stephanie discussed earlier. So what we're seeing here is this quantifiable value that I mentioned on the previous slide, where there's potentially three options. You could have a diesel generator, you could have battery storage, or you could have neither, which might potentially lead to some amount of outages, referred here as lost load or value of lost load. What we're doing here is taking a weighted average of these three possibilities. So in discussion with utilities who have more on-the-ground insight into what's happening, if there were hypothetically a 95% chance that there's a diesel generator and a 5% chance that there would be backup battery storage, we would take the weighted average of those two values, which would give us our quantified environmental justice compensation for our bridged wires values. And then on top of that, we still have all these values that we know have very clear impacts, but we don't have a really obvious way of quantifying them. We aren't able to put a dollar value on them. In places where we have no clear dollar values, we plan to use an equity adder, which would be a percentage proxy adder to demonstrate that there is value, even if we're unable to quantify it. So the exact number here is something that we're hoping to determine based on conversations with stakeholders, both including the people on this call in breakout rooms, as well as some more targeted stakeholder outreach that we'll be conducting in the future. And then in addition to that, we're doing research into values used in other studies and in other jurisdictions. So that equity adder, again, accounts for values that we're not able to quantify, and that will be applied to both the bridged wires case as well as the deferral case to ensure that we are accounting for benefits that are predominantly seen in our environmental justice populations throughout the study. With that, I'll hand it back to Andrew to discuss the upcoming break.
Thanks. So we're going to jump into a break here for about 10 minutes, but before we get to that, I want to make sure we're not putting too much time in between any questions or clarification you might all need. So I'm going to pause for a few minutes. I see Zach has been patiently waiting. Thank you for that. And if there's anybody else that would like to raise their hand, we can certainly address a few questions now. And then, as I said, we'll move into a 10-minute break and then talk about compensation and then to the breakout rooms. So I think, Zach, I won't be able to see necessarily all the hands, but I think, Zach, you were first.
Sure. Thank you so much. This is Zach Wigan from the Vehicle Grid Integration Council, or VGIC. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, excellent. Well, yeah, first off, wanted to thank the RMI and E3 and Mass CC teams for hosting the workshop today. And it's really refreshing to see the level of sort of thorough work and thought that's gone into the analysis thus far. My question regards the bridged wires definition. I think it was slide 37, 38, somewhere around there. My comment doesn't necessarily impact maybe the methodology, but just wanted to offer maybe a point of clarification or a potential enhancement to that definition, which seems to imply a situation where you may have a upgrade need that's ongoing, and then you're saying in the interim we're going to go seek some alternative solutions such as DERs. And in doing so, you're offering certain customers an opportunity to mitigate the impact of constraints caused by maybe other customers. One enhancement here is maybe to think about the opportunity for customers to mitigate their own impacts. In other words, there may be the case, I think, that's suggested by the definition where, again, you have upgrade need, and then you're going out and telling customers, hey, why don't you use your DERs to help provide an interim solution. But it could be that the need itself was caused by that DER, for example, a large fleet depot of EV charging equipment, and you can say to them, hey, why don't you participate in some rate or program or opportunity here that recognizes and compensates the inherent flexibility you can provide as an interim solution to the upgrade that you yourself are deferring. So hopefully that made sense, and I'm trying to stay away from abstraction a little bit here, but I'm happy to answer questions on that comment if the folks from E3 or others want to clarify anything there.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. We can definitely consider those aspects as well, and definitely recognize that there's a lot of value just in managing load, whether it's from EVs or other solutions, and that can contribute as well. I think Alex was next as far as the questions go. comments?
Yeah, hey everybody. I'll repeat the thanks for the presentation. Fantastic so far. Really love all your guys' graphics. Super easy to understand. So just wanted to throw that out there and say thank you for that. My question is on your deferral methodology, and I'm trying to understand or wrap my head around the difference between deferral and avoidance. Because I think avoided cost is something that I think probably a lot of folks on this call are familiar with. Am I understanding correctly that in your methodology, you are always assuming that the infrastructure will eventually be constructed?
Yeah,
So,
Yep.
sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
that's essentially right. Like, I think, yes, in the methodology that we presented here, we are assuming that the investment can't be avoided altogether, and that eventually the capacity constraint on whatever infrastructure will need to be upgraded to increase it further. I do think that there is always the possibility that you get to a date in the future and then recognize like it can be deferred even further, or like there is the potential to avoid this. But yes, the methodology, the calculation here depends on an assumption that eventually it will be put in place.
Yeah, thank you.
I would-
That's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just to add a nuance to that though, the kind of split here, and avoided cost is certainly the more common term. We've talked about this and used avoided and deferred costs because typically avoided costs also really is focused on deferral, even though we call it avoided. The kind of trait or split between those though is when you get to the point where you're deferring something for the entire lifetime of the asset, that's equivalent to basically avoiding that replacement. So that's where they would effectively break even.
Yeah, okay, understood, and that's really helpful. And just to be clear, then this avoidance concept is not captured in your optionality framework as well. It's really based on the assumed life or the assumed period of time for that deferral to get to avoidance. Is that right?
Yes, I'd say largely. The optionality is kind of a subset of the deferral, avoided and deferred costs broadly, but we talk about in deferral because that's the more common scenario.
Okay, yep, thank you, appreciate it.
I think Dick Brooks, do you have a question or comment?
Yep, can you hear me okay?
It's a little bit quiet.
Sorry.
No worries. Certainly had audio issues myself.
Is that any better?
Well, I can I'll just turn up the volume so I can at least hear, and I'll try to repeat if it's not loud enough for anyone else.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, Dick.
No worries.
Business Cyber Guardian. So my question to you regards the bridge to wires solution that you looked at, and it seemed like you looked at portable generators for your application or for your model. Did you consider demand response in any of those models? Thanks.
Yeah, so the question was noting that for bridge to wires, we looked specifically at generators and asking if we had considered demand response in our modeling. I think what we've focused on here, we're certainly appreciate and will and can look into topics as far as it goes to the valuation to some extent. The reason we went with the rental sort of diesel generators at this point is just because it was frankly pretty accessible to get the information on and have certain response. I think the demand response would actually be pretty similar to what this program is trying to address with DERs or having kind of the customer-sided distributed grid services, as opposed to kind of rolling out a proxy solution. So that's the rationale behind that. Though, frankly, if we can get better data on and have suggestions for sources and approaches on ways to better address the bridge to wires benefit and or the environmental justice benefits, especially, we're certainly open to hearing and entertaining those. We're not intending to fully change the approaches at a broad or high level here. But for kind of those different aspects for looking at that proxy data, certainly we will gladly take whatever input you can provide.
Assume that you'll use the generator as a portable generator as a benchmark, and then look at other alternatives and compare against that benchmark.
Yes. So, and actually to clarify, the generator is not what we're suggesting. This might already be clear, but the generator is not what we're suggesting as this is the solution. We're just using that as exactly that, a benchmark or a proxy for what costs might be avoided by some sort of distributed grid services program.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. And Wheezy, I think you're next.
Thank you. I have two connected questions, so let me say what they both are. Where have you in this cost out the cost of an outage to the final end user? And if you've done that, have you looked at the cost to people who may be in EJ communities or impacted communities or people who are poorer, the impact that the cost of an outage may be more to somebody who has fewer resources to accommodate an outage?
I can take this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So part of our EJ impact study, we'll be looking at the value of lost load and the value of outages to customers. So that hopefully answers the first part. For the second part, I absolutely agree that there are different types of customers with different values of outages, whether that is a family that can't afford to rebuy groceries or someone who has medical devices and needs potentially life-saving equipment. If you have any suggestions on specific sources we could use to value those for different segments of customers, for EJ customers in particular, would love to hear those suggestions, especially when we get to breakout rooms.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because the cost of an outage seems like it would be part of the costing that you're considering. And it sounds like it's only being taken into account as it comes to equity in the EJ communities, as opposed to as a basic of how you cost these decisions. Am I missing something about, we definitely wouldn't want major outages to happen, and that, I mean, it's like outages matter.
I can take that, Wheezy. So I think that that's exactly what we're trying to do with the bridge to wires value. While we're using a backup diesel generator as a proxy, we're essentially saying that that generator would be rolled out to a community that is facing the possibility of an outage. So it's a way to ensure that we're avoiding that outage, and therefore the generator cost is the proxy or the cost of avoiding that outage.
Thank you.
And then I think we'll just have Robert, I see your hands up. So we'll have a question from you and then we'll move it over into the break. We'll definitely appreciate continuing the questions and conversation as we move into the breakout room section after we talk through compensation. But just to make sure we're still moving ahead. Robert, did you want to ask your question or add your comment? And then we'll
Yes, I had a couple of questions. The bridge to wires is looks like you're calculating the benefit on a specific period of time. And I think just in general, so that may have an impact on, adoption and the attractiveness to folks that are going to offer these services. So there's going to want to be an element of predictability. So if that benefit's going to disappear after a period of time, that could be an issue. But just more broadly, I'm thinking about predictability of, multi-year predictability of these kinds of these grid revenues. I mean, in our customers' cases, they're doing a lot of DR, which is a very low capital cost. But we will be working with customers putting in a battery, and then in a battery, that's a multi-year investment. You'd want to know that this revenue stream was consistent.
Yeah, that actually is a perfect segue into our compensation conversation. So we do want to talk about it. I might hold off on answering or responding to that right now until we move to that, if that's fine with you. Okay.
Andrew, there are a
So
couple questions in the chat. I don't know if you have a couple seconds to take those.
thanks. Yeah, apologies.
One is
Apologies.
clarify what you mean by the value of load growth. Maybe they're referring to value of lost load rather than load growth, but
Yeah, I guess, Paula, would you mind, would you be able to clarify that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
perfect. So I kind of heard you saying that part of how you are trying to integrate benefits for EJ communities, it's through a value of load growth. That was the part that I didn't quite follow. And I'm sorry if I misunderstood, but if you could clarify, that would be awesome.
No. Yeah, no worries. And we're going through a lot of material here, so certainly don't apologize for asking any questions. I guess, Hannah, did you want to take that one? Otherwise, I can take a stab at it.
Sure. So we talked about the value of lost load here, which is the acronym VOLL. And the value of lost load here specifically refers to the value or the cost to a specific customer of a power outage. So when we say lost load, we mean losing a customer who loses their ability to use electric devices. So that value generally refers to the costs, either directly in dollars or in value, to a specific customer of having a power outage for a certain number of hours. Does that help your understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And so are you trying to also, and I think this is connected to a previous question in terms of avoid the cost or the fair cost, are you also trying to use a proxy here in terms of impacts for EJ communities?
Yeah, so I think Stephanie touched on this earlier. I think first order, we don't want there to be outages. So that's in part what some of these other potential methods would be. So in a case where additional infrastructure is needed to serve a neighborhood or community, there are options that the utility would pursue before just letting the power go out for a community. So that's where we talk about these diesel generators and potential batteries. If we do think there could be potential lost load, potential power outages, is when we start looking at these values. There's a number of studies out there that put dollar values on these. And it's something that I think as a community, as an industry, we're hoping to get more granularity in these values, especially for environmental justice populations, especially for low-income customers, and especially for customers with various medical needs that have an even higher value of that access to electricity. So if you have any insights into those numbers or experience working with those communities, we would definitely value your input on those.
Thank you, Hannah.
And then I see there's one other, or at least I see one other question on the environmental impact. I'm going to address this and then we'll move into the break and we'll plan to come back at 1:30. So as far as the question, I think from Jennifer about whether we're going over environmental impact now and in the future. So I think part of this goes to the question of what we're focused on with this study, and just without flipping back through all of the slides, there's the graphic about the Clean Peak and net metering and all these other programs existing in Massachusetts. And some of those are intended to address more the emissions aspects of DERs and how they can help combat that. There is still an environmental impact, not purely greenhouse gases, that we're talking about here, about the air quality impact that's on this slide, as Hannah talked about a little bit with that diesel generators as sort of an alternative interim solution. But that I think is the primary way that that's factoring into this study, is we're more focused on kind of things that are not covered elsewhere and want to make sure it's only incrementality that's included. And does that answer your question, Jennifer, before I turn it to the break?
Oh yeah, it does. Thanks so much. And will you folks be sending out the slides?
Yes, we'll be posting them actually on the Grid Services website. I threw the link to that in the chat a little bit earlier. I can certainly add it again in case anybody joined later and aren't able to see that or anything else. But yeah, we'll post these slides and the recording on the website. You'll also be able to see the workshop 1 slides and recording and the primer we put together all on that same website as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And just to move things along, I'm going to jump into the break now. We'll come back, I guess, just as we're running a little bit behind, and apologies for that. We'll plan to come back in, well, let's say we'll give it 7 minutes, so 1:32 Eastern time. We'll see you all back here, and then we'll start talking about the compensation mechanisms. And then instead of having a Q&A after that piece, we'll move it right into the breakout rooms, which Armaya will explain again. And that's where we would love to hear even more questions and feedback. So appreciate it. Okay, so I'm gonna jump back into this. We'll talk through some compensation mechanisms and then move into the even more interactive and creative portion with the breakout rooms. Recognizing that it seems like there might have been a few more questions in chat, and if any come up during the compensation mechanisms, we might pivot a little bit here, and I'll give just a few minutes for additional questions after we get through the compensation mechanisms. If anyone has those that they would prefer to ask, just clarifying pieces that they expect will be helpful to the larger group before we break off into the smaller breakout rooms and pass it back to RMI for that. So with that, I'm going to just get started. So we're going to start talking about potential different types of compensation mechanisms. And this will lead to our sort of, I guess, mechanism recipe potentially. But these are not intended to be prescriptive. This is just really ideas, thoughts, kind of general principles in designing compensation mechanisms rather than saying that these are what we're restricting ourselves to by any means. So first, starting with compensation design, we'll bring back this graphic from earlier on. We have the 3 broad policy goals that we want compensation design to balance. We want to encourage participation by DERs, making sure we're getting any program off the ground. We want to be able to generate real value for the grid and broader community, which sort of comes from that. And then we want to be able to account for and manage any potential cost shifting or balance of the value between what participants are getting and ratepayers as well. So in support of these goals, while also keeping them all at least relatively simple, both for participants and administrators, we have a number of different important considerations shown on the right here. So participants are going to need some level of clarity and certainty. I think to Robert's point here as well, if they're going to invest or at least set aside capacity to participate in this program. We do want to make sure, or at least consider this as we're looking to potentially provide things such as advanced reservation payments, and I'll talk about those in a little bit to support that. At the same time, compensation should also be primarily structured in such a way that it elicits the behavior that we want, making sure we're getting from the DERs what actually provides value. So for that instance, there might be some aspect of performance that needs to be factored in. Since we're discussing distribution grid services and want to factor in equity impacts, the location is going to matter pretty significantly, and the timing for both the infrastructure as well as the communities near which these DERs are sited. Then finally, in the long term, compensation should be rooted somehow in the value that's provided to ratepayers. That's why we spent the whole first half of this meeting on what we did. Ideally, it should be structured in a way that provides net financial benefits, ideally to both participants and ratepayers if we can. So these considerations are reflected in number of different compensation components. They can be displayed in different ways, but one helpful structure for considering or including these considerations, we can think of them in terms of different components that the earlier Baringa study that had worked with Mass CEC on very related and tied into this topic really on grid services had included. So there's this table on the left here, this pulled out of that study, and want to just walk through a few of these different components at a high level. You can read through the rest as well. And I don't want anybody to get too bogged down on terminology here. This is just the components and a way to define or describe them generally, but you might be familiar with these under a different name, certainly. So calling out a couple of these at the very top here, price, of course, is always a very important one. It's the incentive dollar amount. And we want to talk about how this can be determined really based on a total pool of distribution grid services value. Again, this is really what the focus of the beginning of the presentation on is, sort of setting this kind of guideline or North Star for what that value can be at. It's not setting the exact price though, it's just giving us some background or context for it. The volume component is, in this terms, we're thinking of it as the kind of total kilowatt capacity allotted for participants. So this will be defined as a very location-specific basis based on whatever the expected local grid need is. So if you need to supply 10 kilowatts or 10 megawatts of capacity at a location in order to alleviate some grid need, then that's the volume of participation that we'll be looking to elicit. Tenor, or potentially may refer to it as tenure, here talks about the length of applicable contract terms. So this is something else to consider. There's degree of control, availability that DERs are committing to be able to to hold themselves available and provide capacity across a certain period of time. Allocation, how to select those DERs, stacking with other incentive programs. This is why it's important that we're looking only incrementally at the distribution grid services value. And then you have things like the payment basis and performance as well. So that's to the point I mentioned on the last slide, kind of our means of evaluating what is successful delivery of grid services. How do we know that the DERs have actually performed as needed to provide the value to the grid? And as a means of working all of these different components and several others into compensation, we can think of a few different types of payments as our tools. So one potential category would be reservation payments. So I'm just going to define the term here. So if we use it later, this is what you know what we're referring to, but this is the idea of sort of set payments provided to all selected participants for committing to have capacity available within a certain window. This would be basically, we could say we're going to pay you X amount per year, and you're going to agree to provide this amount of capacity if called upon. So this payment goes out regardless of whether you're called upon. It's really just to kind of hold your space. And this provides some level of certainty to DERs and participants in any general program structure. There's also performance payment. So this is what it sounds like, just a payment issued to DERs when they're called upon for performing. So this is a little bit less certain in terms of when you're going to get this payment, how it might be allocated or split up. But this is really reflecting the true value that's provided or some component of the value. This is really how we ensure that DERs are performing in the way that we want them to after we've kind of reserved that capacity. And then another aspect, the less rosy side, is if there are penalties that might be owed by DERs if you receive the reservation payment but don't perform as agreed upon. So these are all kind of different levels, and there certainly can be others as well. But just to keep it relatively simple, I'm going to walk through a few different examples of compensation structures using these. So first structure I'm going to walk through, and I'll have a slide on each of these, is just a performance only payment. This is sort of a pure, what value are you providing to the grid? When is it being provided? Or what value are DERs providing, rather? Another option would be to have some sort of consistent upfront reservation payment to provide some level of certainty, and then a performance-based payment, so getting both aspects of this baked in. Another option we'll walk through is a reservation payment. You could potentially increase during active years for whether it's a deferral or a bridge to wires situation. And then you also have a performance-based payment. And then the fourth option is if you have that reservation payment, again, amp it up during the years that you're actually really needing the behavior from the DERs, but with a penalty for any DERs that don't respond. So it's more penalizing the stick rather than the carrot here. And so we want to get your input on these. We're going to walk through these just at a high level.
Andrew, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Gideon Banner. I'm seeing a comment, a question from Dick Brooks in the chat that others might be having as well. He's asking whether reservation payments, which you have here on the screen, repeated in several instances, whether that means the same thing as a capacity payment or whether it's a different concept.
Yeah, I think broadly you can think of it as a kind of reserved capacity payment as well. Thanks for jumping in. And also just to note, we'll definitely have a little bit of time at the end of this to address questions broadly before we move to the breakouts. But thank you for the clarifying point. I'm defining these here, not because these have to be the only terms used, but just to translate if you've used other terminology in other programs or seen it used. Certainly many of these terms might be interchangeable with others.
No, I'm in a meeting, a workshop, I'm multitask.
So the other piece here, I guess, just generally is I'm going to present these structures, 4 different options, but we also want to hear from you in the breakout rooms and potentially afterwards as well, if you have any ideas for other structures that might be appealing. So first example I noted is the performance only payment. So I've got just the description at the top and then a table at the bottom kind of illustrating out what might occur for the different cash flows or payment streams. So in this case, the payment is based purely on the kilowatt of capacity that's provided during specific call events or kilowatt hours as it might be. Not all participants might be called during a given year. Basically, the utility would only call what DERs they need and what quantity they need. And the contracting could be on an annual or a multi-year basis to give a little bit more certainty in advance. But again, because it's based on the call, that would really just set the price. The payments could be determined then, or the final payment amount at the end of each year, depending on what the total deferral value determined is and the number of kilowatts called are. And just to note here, I'm using deferral value just as a shorthand here. This could also include bridge to wires, but just to keep this consistent throughout, think of this as grid services value more broadly as well. So in this example, the top row here is the grid services value that's being provided. That's calculated kind of on the valuation side. You see that there's no value in the first few years. There's no need yet. And then years 5 through 8, you can see that there's clearly some need. And the value per kilowatt is assigned, is provided there. So it's $10 a year. This is really straightforward as far as compensation goes. Compensation is exactly what that deferral value is. This doesn't account for any discount rates, any other policy decisions as far as how those relate to each other. This is just the simplest, most straightforward approach. So compensation occurs in the same years at the same time and to everybody that gets called upon, just purely based on that value. Second scenario makes things a little bit more complicated, but in the interest of providing a little bit more certainty for DERs, which is good not only for the participants in a program, but also for the utility, because the utility can't actually defer an investment or plan to defer investments or bridge to wire solutions until they know that there's actually DERs available to call upon. So in this case, we've noted that these are sort of upfront reservation payments going out. And so the idea is this is referring or providing payment or reserving space even before there's actually the expected need to be called upon. So it may be that they get called upon earlier or later than expected, but as long as this reservation is in place, it's all set up. This gives both participants some sort of at least nominal stream of income in the early years and a reason to build that capacity and make sure that they're having it readily available. And also gives the utilities a little bit more certainty around, hey, we have all these DERs, we've got this space reserved. And so if we're confident that they can meet our needs, then we can actually go ahead and defer this investment without worrying about there being some shortfall later on and again, having that bad situation where there's an outage and lost load because of this. So in this case, you can see the deferral value is the same on that top line, but then there's reservation payments going out every single year, including before the deferral value is actually really appearing. And then you have the secondary piece, which is the performance payment or the compensation based on the calls that are actually given. So this is the third line item here. And then you can look at the total compensation. Again, as I noted, this is very simplified. We're not looking at net present value or discounting or the value in individual years. We're just looking at it as a simple total. But you can see that basically the deferral value at the top adds up to that compensation total at the bottom. It's just distributed in a different way than in the prior slide where we had it all go into those performance payments. A third example just to consider is if you increase reservation payments during the years when you expect to have that actual deferral or bridge to wires value occurring. So this is basically just shifting more of the money from the compensation to calls or performance payment into the reservation payments, but specifically in the years where you expect to be active. So you can think of this as basically the same thing as on the prior slide, except you're increasing reservation payments when you expect that there's actually going to be an active need. So the benefit of this is that you can increase kind of your certainty or likelihood of having resources available during those years when needed. And you can either take that money out of earlier year reservation payments or from the performance payments here. That's what's shown on the screen. But again, you get that same sort of total value of compensation in this sense is equal to the value that's being provided to the grid. And then finally, this scenario shows the penalty situation where you have actually much higher reservation payments. It's sort of building on the prior, where you're paying those reservations at a much higher rate during the years that you expect there to actually be a need to call upon anything. And then instead of paying for performance based on the individual calls, you are paying all that money out in reservation payments, and then you penalize any DERs that aren't actually performing as they've committed to. And so these penalties necessarily have to be very severe, both to sort of make up that revenue that's potentially lost for the grid as well if this value is not actually showing up. But really, the DERs not showing up is much worse than that, because then you're potentially in a situation where you've said, I'm not going to build something yet to meet this need because I think I have capacity. But if the DERs don't show, you neither have the capacity from the DERs nor from the infrastructure. And so you have an outage or some other issue with the system. So these penalties might even be steeper than this in order to really make sure that DERs are actually performing as they're committed to. So all of these are just potential structures that could be considered. There's certainly many more options out there, but wanted to put a few in front of you just to sort of get the creative juices flowing, as they say, or stir the pot before we move into the breakout rooms and talk about this. So before I pass things over to Brett and RMI to discuss the breakout rooms, I want to open just a couple minutes if there are any clarifying questions here. Less focused on the comments. We are really interested in hearing those, but the breakout rooms will be a great opportunity for those. But if there's clarifying questions either on the valuation we talked about remaining or on these compensation pieces. So I see Zach, you have your hand raised again. I'll start with you, and then I'll take a look in the comments as well after that.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. Zach Wigan from the Vehicle Grid Integration Council, or VGIC. Thanks for letting me ask so many questions today. In terms of the structure here, is the thinking that a need would be identified and then this compensation would be offered to customers on that same circuit? So beyond the design of the rate, what's the sort of implementation approach that's being envisioned here?
Yeah, so we'll want to hear thoughts and feedback on this, but at a very broad level, because we've mentioned it so many times. I'm hoping we really get the point across today, but this value is largely at a somewhat local level, and so we want the compensation to correspondingly be at least relatively localized. So it might not be all the way down to the circuit level quite yet. But what we've looked at is looking kind of substation by substation to see if that's an appropriate level to distinguish that if you're located at this substation, maybe, then this is what we approximate the value that distribution grid services that DERs could provide, and therefore anyone at that substation under these circumstances receives that level of compensation. Next substation over might be different if you're in an environmental justice population or not as well.
Great. Thank you, Andrew.
And then Greg or Gregory.
So I was just curious, is when you guys were formulating these compensation frameworks, if anyone took a look at the Clean Peak Standard and attempted to see if there are any elements of that framework that would be applicable to this effort. Give me some similarities.
Yeah, I guess I'd say we can certainly, and we have looked at the folks on the line. Many are very familiar with the different Massachusetts programs, more so than myself for sure. But we have taken looks at those programs more so in looking at what's existing and the other compensation streams for other pieces. I do want to just make it clear here that we want to distinguish and not be kind of double counting for anything that's under the Clean Peak Standard and what's being compensated for there. But yes, as far as mechanisms go, we can certainly look at any of the existing programs or compensation mechanisms out there already in Massachusetts or in other jurisdictions and consider those. What I've presented here are very kind of just broad basics of structures in order to open up the floor to ideas, because we don't want to constrain ourselves to a single one. But yes, whether structures mirror or are similar to sort of what's in the Clean Peak or what's done by any of these utilities in other states or anywhere really could be something brand new. We do want to consider and get feedback from all of you now through the breakout rooms and over the coming weeks onto that.
Yeah, I would just offer there's some value in minimizing complexity. And these programs tend to have very high complexity thresholds.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. It's easier to plug and play if you're already familiar with another structure. So you can certainly consider that one.
Thank you.
And apologies, I'm having some issues seeing the chat at the moment. But anyone else on the line is able to bring it up, I'd appreciate that.
I think the other questions in the chat have been responded to, and Zach was just providing some more clarity to Gregory's comment. I do see Dick Brooks has their hand raised, so maybe there's one more clarifying question.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess we'll move to you, Dick, and then I want to move over to RMI and the breakout rooms because we want to make sure there's plenty of time for that. We did bake in sort of flexible space within the 3 hours, but want to make sure there's lots for that piece of the discussions. So Dick, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Dick Brooks, Business Cyber Guardian. So my question to you is, are you envisioning a competitive market for these service offerings that will need to be cleared some way, like the capacity markets are today at ISO New England?
So I'm going to just repeat again to make sure I heard fully, and so if anybody else not, I think Dick's question was, are you considering a competitive market where prices need to be cleared in order to select participants? I think we're pretty broadly open to consideration here. I think this would go into sort of that allocation piece as far as figuring out which participants might get selected. We are, I guess, broadly speaking, I would say open to nearly all possibilities at this point for that. So if you have a input on which you think is best or what you think should be improved upon that you've seen elsewhere, certainly please do provide that, and we'll be happy to take that into account.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this could potentially provide you with price discovery, especially if you're going to have services valued at having different values based on what they provide, like ramping versus, other services that aren't nearly as time sensitive. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. And just one last note on that. The other pieces we're kind of thinking of this as a near term and a long term. So competitive markets can take a little bit longer to build up. And so we might start in the near term with something a little bit more, not purely just structured, but more top down, if that's what it takes in order to start building up this program. And then potentially in the long term view, we can consider things like that as well. So we do want that feedback now, but this will move into workshops 3 and 4 as we talk about the near term and long term roadmaps.
Thank you very much.
And Brett, I'm going to pass it over to you now for the breakout rooms.
That's great. Thanks so much, Andrew. Okay, so we are going to split folks into 5 breakout rooms. People will be randomly assigned, and if you are on a device that where you cannot access a breakout room, we have a plan for you, and we will reassign one of the breakout rooms back to this main room to be sure we can allow everyone to participate. Each breakout room will have a facilitator and a note taker. And the breakout rooms will aim to cover the 4 topic areas that were just presented. So valuation, compensation, implementation, and the environmental justice impacts and considerations, with a focus on the compensation, EJ, and implementation portions. The order of those topics will vary by breakout room. So in the event a room doesn't have a chance to get through all 4 topics, we will hope to have coverage across the whole workshop. The facilitator will guide the discussion and track time in order to move us through those topics. And the breakout rooms are really focused on gathering your input and feedback to inform our study inputs and outputs. And I just want to reiterate that there is no expectation of expertise in any particular field required. We really value the input from diverse perspectives, so encourage you all to share your thoughts and reflections. The breakout rooms will include a shared workspace to capture your ideas and input, and your facilitator will share a link to this space once you're in the breakout room. If you cannot access the workspace, the facilitator will also share their screen so that you can follow along and provide verbal input. And then we will plan to reconvene in this main room in 45 minutes, where we will have a brief 2-minute share out by the note takers in each breakout room. So note takers, be thinking about this as we're moving through the content in the breakout rooms. And the brief share outs will be focused on sharing 1 to 3 key themes or ideas that came up in each breakout room, just so we can have a sense of what's bubbling to the top. Great. And it actually looks like, as we expected, there might be some attrition, so we may end up just having 4 breakout rooms, which should be just fine. So great. So Mass CEC folks, I guess, feel free to move us into the breakout rooms, and then the facilitators will take over from there. Hopefully those were fruitful discussions in the breakout rooms. Really appreciate everyone's perspectives and taking the time in focusing in on some of your input and feedback. That was very helpful, at least in our breakout room. I would love to invite the note takers from each breakout room just to share 1 to 3 bullets that summarize some of the themes or key ideas that were coming up in your breakout room. And this can be, 2 minutes maximum. I'd say 90 seconds is what we're sort of aiming for here. So is there any note taker from a breakout room that would volunteer to go first? Feel free to just come off mute and
I can go
report out.
first since we were breakout 1, if that works.
Thanks, Katie.
Sure. Yeah, echoing Brett's thoughts, thanks so much, everyone. It was really great to learn from all your perspectives in the breakout. We spent a lot of time looking at valuation and compensation in breakout room 1, and I think some of the high-level themes we talked about were kind of the balance between simplicity and accuracy, as well as the balance between customer needs and grid needs. And so in our compensation conversation, we had a lot, our energy was kind of split between performance only and kind of the upfront reservation compensation. And on the performance only side, folks really appreciated the simplicity of that. But then in the reservation system, folks really liked how predictable that was and helpful for grid planners. So kind of managing that balance as we think about these different compensation strategies. And then we talked a little bit about implementation as well. And there was a recognition that there's a lot of education needed around how to roll these programs out, and specifically really targeted education for folks that this would specifically relate to, and that can be done through app push notifications for folks that have existing devices, and can be done using utilities, EDCs, and installers. So that's kind of the summary of breakout group 1.
Thanks so much, Katie. Can we move to breakout room 2, for which Charles was the note taker, I believe?
Sure, Brett. So I think our discussion in breakout room 2 touched on a couple of different issues. I think first around encouraging customers to enroll and reaching customers. On the encouraging enrollment side, there was some discussion about needing to make the program kind of worth the while for participants to spend time thinking about and putting in the upfront effort to enroll. And some of that touches on the need for incentive levels to be high enough to make that worth their while. We also talked about whether there are ways to approach this problem to enable more bottom-up adoption of DARs in various communities. On the customer outreach side, a lot of our discussion centered around some of the differences between customer types. With C&I customers have many of them have established relationships with aggregators, so that might be an avenue for reaching those customers. Whereas in the residential sector, the Mass Save program might be a model for a program that has a lot of kind of like brand name recognition and established relationships with communities, especially in the residential side. On the compensation discussion, we touched on a number of different things. One of the key things that came up was the need to reduce risk for participants so that they're not turned off from the program. There was some discussion of ways that you could structure reservation payments to kind of balance the need to make sure that resources show up, potentially with a clawback mechanism, but still reducing kind of the risk and the psychological pain from enrollment. A number of other discussions, wide-ranging, but I'll keep it short there, and we can move on to the next breakout room.
Thanks so much, Charles. So breakout room 3, I believe Hannah was the note taker.
Yep. Breakout room 3, we talked about a lot of things, breaking it broadly into 3 categories. We talked about a number of different customer-facing impacts, so things like bill impacts, grid resiliency, but then you also have the need to access these technologies in order to unlock those savings. Specifically in Massachusetts and New England, there's a lot of older buildings that might need additional upgrades in order to unlock these types of technologies. We also talked about the customer experience of participating in a program like this as a trade-off with predictability for grid operators, as well as what we're defining as an environmental justice population, and some of the trade-offs of federal versus state-specific data sources there. We also, on that topic, touched on challenges with potentially predatory third-party suppliers and some learnings from other programs. As far as understanding the needs and some of the analysis side, we talked about the value of AMI data rollout, as well as looking at other programs that have already existed and trying to build in connections and consolidations with other existing programs. And then we also talked about the operational efficiencies of stacking or optimizing across multiple programs, or lack thereof, as the case may be. As far as compensation and developer needs, we talked about some examples from New York and Connecticut and programs they have, and the importance of revenue certainty and revenue clarity, including things like locking in a performance rate for a 10-year period, or having the reservation payment to allow developers for larger resources to have some certainty for investors as they plan their finances for the long term.
Great. Thanks so much, Hannah. Appreciate it. So moving to breakout room number 4, Sophia, I believe.
Yeah, that's me. So in our breakout room on the equity and justice impacts, we talked about the ratepayer risk of a new program. And so that's how we can proactively invest to create the most benefit for these EJ groups. Distribution grid services planning can mitigate ratepayer risk, but we talked about how it can also increase it. We have to be wary of compensating developers more than the value that they are providing to the grid. So we want to make sure that the design is appropriate to ensure that the opposite impact occurs. We also talked about how historically there have been barriers for EJ communities to participate in programs. So we need these communities to be able to benefit directly from their own infrastructure, their sale of electricity, and have access to all the benefits. So specific barriers we can remove. Also, data sources to quantify EJ communities and measure the impacts. And then finally, on the compensation side, we talked about the value of certainty. So that's how utilities need to know how much they can depend on a certain asset to defer, while developers need certainty of their revenue streams.
Great. Thanks so much, Sophia. Yeah, thank you all very much again for all of your input in that targeted portion. There was a question in the chat about the links to the breakout rooms staying open. And yeah, I think those should remain active. So if folks have additional thoughts in any of these topic areas or to the questions that were posed and you want to drop them in there, we would certainly welcome that. So thanks very much. And I will pass it back to E3 and the Mass CEC team.
Thanks, Brett. And again, thank you everyone for participating in the breakout rooms and all the discussions there. Are you able to see my screen with the slides? Just have a few last ones to get through. Yep. Okay, thanks. So again, appreciate the discussion and we really want to keep it going. We've already presented this before, but just to flash these up again, please share any questions, comments, thoughts, anything that you weren't able to get to in the breakout room or that you start to think of afterwards with us over email. You have our emails listed here for the Mass CEC, myself, and for Brett as well. So please continue to share these over the coming days and weeks. And if you prefer to also set up one-on-one conversations to discuss any input, just as a different format, just let us know and we can work to arrange that. I want to note we're also setting up a few focus groups, and I think Hannah had mentioned this before, but specifically to engage stakeholders and organizations representing EJ populations or that are able to provide input there. So if you really engaged with or wanted to spend more time on that piece of the breakout rooms, this is a great chance. So as we're working to consider all these pieces with equity, participation is huge for that. And if you think you might be a good fit or know of other organizations or individuals that would be a good fit for these focus groups, please reach out to us and we can work to incorporate your input as well. For next kind of workshops and immediate opportunities after this, in addition to all these other modes of communication, we want to note we still are only part of the way through the workshop series. Done workshop 1 back in December, workshop 2 is today. Our next workshop 3, we want to dive even further into compensation mechanisms and start talking about near-term implementation as well. So really focused on what we've been discussing in the breakout rooms. Largely, we also will want to share back whatever we've heard from you today and in the following weeks. Basically just share that out with the group and make sure everyone's views have a chance to be aired for everyone. So we'll be focusing on those 2 pieces in the next workshop, expecting it to be, we haven't locked in a date yet, but probably mid to late April. So please keep an eye out for the invite there. After that, we'll also have workshop 4 to present our findings at that point. This will be end of spring, early summer, and discuss sort of longer term implementation considerations and roadmap. And that'll all culminate with a final report in early this summer. So if you are not on the invite list and you'd like to be included for workshops 3 or 4, or you just want more information about the program or contact anything else, all this information, as well as workshop session slides and the recordings for this meeting and the last one, will be made available on the Mass DEC website here. And I can toss it in the chat right after I stop sharing my screen again afterwards. I had also added it to the chat earlier on in the meeting, if you don't mind scrolling through a little bit. But we'll send future meeting announcements to the workshop mailing list. The link is in these slides, which again will be posted. And there's also that link is located on that webpage. So hopefully you should be able to find it there. I think the last piece is just that I want to make sure everyone's aware of these resources, I guess, generally. And thank you all again for all your attendance and participation now and going forward. And I think I'll pass it back to Mass DEC if you have any last words.
I have a couple last words. One, thank you to everyone, especially who stuck through it. I see people dropping like flies, but we very much appreciate all of the thoughts, engagement. It's awesome. Second, just want to remind of one part of this, and that this really is, this project is a vision of doing this much deeper and earlier collaboration among grid stakeholders, including bringing our utilities into these really early stages of envisioning something like this. And we're really excited for you all to be engaged in and part of that process. We think that doing this in a slightly different way than we have in the past is so important for a successful energy transition. So this is a new model of doing this type of collaboration. So thank you for sticking with us in it. Third, kind of along the same lines, this is something new. It's very new. There's not many other places in the country that have done something like this. And so I really appreciate people engaging with kind of the uncertainty and the kind of, I don't know, the nuance to it, because we really are thinking of new ideas here and trying to figure out what could this look like and how are we going to start getting things happening on the ground that we can start learning from. And so this is really the first stages of something that will evolve over time. We're not thinking that, you know, when this report comes out in the summer, we're all of a sudden going to have this new large scale program. Like, this is something that's going to evolve. And so we really appreciate everyone's input into how that could look. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we have the sessions on the near term and long term implementation. So thank you. And hopefully we'll see you all again in our next session. And before that, if you have more thoughts.